God has all the power in the world to intervene. If he wanted to intervene, he would have stopped Hitler from killing the 6 million people. The only reason God didn't do it, according to Satmar Rebbe, based on very traditional theology. It's not like Satmar Rebbe is an outcast on this, by the way. That's actually very classic theology. It must have been for a reason.
Welcome back to this channel. My name is Frida Wiesel, and here I explore the story of insular Jewish societies in New York. For a long time, I wanted to do a segment about the Satmar Rabbi, the great Satmar Rabbi, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum. I was born in the Satmar community a few years after the rabbi's passing, and I grew up hearing of Rabbi Yoel, which is what we call the Satmar Rabbi, as a larger-than-life figure. If you watched my segments with the Satmar woman Pearl, you might have heard what a profound loss his passing was for her generation. Yet the Satmar Rabbi is also known for his controversial conservative position, especially for his staunch anti-Zionism. He draws reverence from all corners of the world, also criticism. I've long wanted to better understand the Satmar Rebbe and do a deep dive video, but put it off because it's so daunting to try to speak of such an enormous figure who's often portrayed in such contradicting narratives. Today, I'm finally braving the subject with my wonderful guest, Rabbi Yisachar Katz. So please join me for the interview and in the comments section. For those who are not familiar with Rabbi Katz, let me introduce him to you. Rabbi Yisachar Katz is a renowned rabbi with deep roots in the Satmar world. He grew up in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, where the Satmar Hasidic group is headquartered. He studied in Satmar as well as other major iconic yeshivas like Brisk, and he received smicha, his rabbinic ordination, from Satmar. For many years, he was one of the most prominent teachers of a daily Talmud study session in Hasidic Borough Park. Years on, Rabbi Katz switched affiliations with more modern branch of Orthodoxy. He served as the senior rabbi of the Prospect Heights Shul and is now the chair of the Talmud department at Yeshiva Chavavai Torah. Rabbi Yisachar Katz has been involved in a great deal of Jewish education projects, writing, teaching, lecturing, composing halachic responsa on many of the cutting-edge issues of the day. And some of you may also know him because of his presence online. He keeps an active, interesting, intelligent discussion going on his Facebook page, where he writes about many Jewish topics and interacts with an engaged readership. And I'll link to that in the video description. So welcome, Rabbi Katz, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this. Was the introduction okay?
Never asked for better.
Okay,
I might use it for future
in your bio. It is very hard to do an introduction on, I think, someone who comes from such a complex,
perfect,
so many facets. In fact, I want to ask you more about your background, specifically about your connection with Satmar. The Satmar Hasidic group, to those who don't know, is one of many sects, but it's probably one of the most insular and most anti-Zionist.
Yeah, sure, Frida, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity. I really appreciate the privilege of sharing my experience with Satmar Rebbe with your audience. I'll give you the short version. The short version of it is that, as you mentioned, I grew up in Williamsburg and was raised in Satmar. Until I was about 17. I studied in Satmar yeshivas, and unlike sometimes the stories we hear about people who have had miserable experience, bad experiences, or anything of that sort, I had none of that. It was really an incredible experience growing up there. Personally, I grew up in an incredibly warm and loving home. My parents were deeply in love and really gave us a very warm and very pleasant experience growing up. And the same is true for my intellectual experience. Studying in Satmar, for those who care about studying, for those who are interested in learning Torah, it's an incredible experience. And after my years of studying there, I left with a real command of the tradition. I left knowing tons of Talmud, I've been exposed to tons of Talmud, to tons of halacha, to tons of others for him. And I really frankly have nothing bad to say about my experience there. I did get kicked out of yeshiva eventually. And of all the reasons, you'll be surprised, that is because they caught me under my bed. And when I usually tell this story, I like to pause and say, no, not what you think. Believe it or not,
It was
believe it or not, yes, exactly. People think, oh, I know what. No, 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 no. That's not what it was. Believe it or not, I got kicked out of the yeshiva because they found a book of the first Lubavitcher Rebbe with commentary of the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, which I don't know if we're going to have time to get into it in our conversation. The animosity between Satmar and Lubavitch, counterintuitively, because they're both Hasidim, was so strong at the time when I was growing up. This goes back about 40 years ago, to the point where someone was suspected of being a crypto Chabadnik, was asked to leave. And I had to leave. There was no negotiating, no compromising. And that's when I went to Israel. And if you grow up in Satmar, where, as we'll talk soon, it's a hardcore anti-Zionist community, there's not any that many alternative options for you. There's 95% of the yeshivot out there are illegitimate from a Satmar person's perspective. But I ended up going to Israel and studying in Brisk, which, if you can excuse the arrogance, in the insular world of the yeshiva world, it's called the Harvard of the yeshivas. So I did end up going to Brisk, and if you can believe it, I actually became even more fanatic than I was. I went through this phase of being extremely, extremely fanatic. Maybe is not the right word. Diligent and stuff is more the word, or punctilious. Very frum in my dress and my behavior and all that. Anyway, I came back. I got married, started a family, and long story short, people evolve, people grow, and after growing in the community again with a family and teaching for many years, I slowly found myself parting ways from the community, more and more feeling that me and the community are not on the same wavelength, primarily theologically. Theologically, just it didn't jive with me. The issues in the community. Again, I want to make this very brief, and I'll be just very honest with you that I would say that if I had to pick one issue that was really hard for me, surprising enough, it was the feminist issue, only because I grew up with incredibly smart women. My mother is an incredibly smart woman. I have 3 sisters. I have 6 aunts. And the discrepancy between my exposure to Judaic studies and theirs just became at some point untenable. Like, why is it fair that I have access to the entire Jewish bookshelf and they don't? And that became just really the breeding ground for more questions and more challenges. And at some point I felt that I had to leave. It was hard. I don't think I'm telling you something you don't know. Leaving is never an easy thing. It's torturous. It's hellish. And it takes years and years of deciding, do I want to leave? Do I want to not want to leave? But anyway, long story short, eventually I left. And I, as you mentioned, I found a home in modern Orthodoxy. And that's where I am now. In the interim, I got divorced and remarried. We have two kids, and they're being raised. It would be unfair to call them modern Orthodox. I would say that was probably a more accurate description would be the way I self-identify and the way we raise our children is modern Hasidish. I'll leave it up to another conversation to elaborate, but that's really the way we identify. And like you mentioned, I am the chair of the Talmud department of Chovevei Torah, where I teach. It's a rabbinical school, and I also have gotten into the experience of writing a lot of response on a bunch of contemporary issues.
And here we are. I want to talk
exactly
more about what your experience was in connection to Satmar Rebbe per se, but we need to deviate for a minute and first of all establish your connection to Lubavitch, which is making this even more complicated. The fact that there is a kind of a tension between Chabad, Lubavitch, and Satmar, and we're talking today about Satmar Rebbe. Would you say that you're getting kicked out of yeshiva over the Lubavitcher text, was that like the beginning of some kind of personal evolution? It all started with Lubavitch.
Oh, so I mean, when I like to be facetious, I say it's all of Lubavitcher Rebbe's fault. Again, each of these questions that you're asking are such complicated and nuanced questions. I mean, we will actually hopefully get to it later in our conversation. Surprisingly enough, and again, I'm just dropping a hint and we'll get back to it more elaborately. Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, completely denounced his Hasidic heritage to the point where he very much self-identified less as a chassid than a rabbi, a scholar. In fact, his closest rabbinic colleagues were Litvish Rosh Yeshivot, not Hasidic Rebbes. I mean, he had a neighbor, the Skvera Rebbe, that he bickered with all the time. Consequently, in the yeshiva, surprisingly enough, there was no room, zero room in the curriculum for studying real hardcore Chassidut. In fact, there were certain books that were prohibited. And the reason why studying Chabad at the time was such a sin is because at some point the kind of, if you can excuse the arrogance, the upper echelon of Satmar Hasidim who were interested in sophisticated Chassidut did not find it in Satmar. Satmar Rebbe really, at least when I was growing up already, had very little patience for Chassidut, as I'm going to explain later. So if you looked for sophisticated Chassidut, you went to the top, and we can discuss the various Chassidim, but in terms of intellectual Chassidut, Chabad really has that. And a lot of the, high-level intellectuals in Satmar became Chabad. I mean, we can talk about so many of the prominent names in contemporary Chabad who originally were Satmar or, offshoot Chassidut. So that's why it was it was so transgressive to do that.
Wow. We're gonna return to what it means to be a rebbe of one of the biggest by now Hasidic groups, and to be again studying Hasidut. Very important subject on its own. But what was your connection?
Can I interrupt you just for a second? Can I just interrupt you for a second? I'm sorry, Frida. I will say that in a nutshell, people want to have a one sentence. Satmar Rebbe was Hasidish, but had nothing to do with Chassidut, meaning his externals were Hasidish, like you said, right? He dressed like a Chassid. He had a Rebbe's, orientation, but in terms of intellectually, theologically, he completely rejected that. So sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, we're going to have to talk about what that means theologically when we talk about it later. So let's first talk about, did you know the Satmar Rebbe at all? Because I didn't know him. He passed away before I got born. Almost all the men in my childhood, my age, were named Joel, Yoeli. They were all Yoeli because they were all named after him, an entire generation of Yoelis. So what was your connection to the Satmar Rebbe, if at all?
Right. So I think I'm a little bit older than you. So
Tiny
I
bit.
did. Exactly.
You're still Yisachar.
Thank you. I overlapped 11 years with him. He died. When he died, I was 11 years old. He actually had a stroke 11 years earlier. So it happens that he had the stroke the Shabbos that I was born. Make of it whatever you want. But he had a stroke, and the stroke was severe in the sense that he was probably functioned at, 10, 20% of capacity, in the sense that he would still come in every Shabbos. He would still, be involved in the high holidays or in Passover or in Purim, but not the way he was when he was healthy. But I still overlapped enough that he was a big presence in my own life, very big presence. I mean, he was really the person that got mentioned every day, perhaps in school. The Rebbe says this, the Rebbe said that, the Rebbe did this, the Rebbe did that, the Rebbe's coming here, the Rebbe's going there. He was very, very present in my my personal life. But in addition to that, there was a little bit of a personal connection because my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was orphaned at a very young age. His father died when he was very young, and his mother was too overwhelmed. And she sent off my grandfather to study in Satmar at a very young age. But he didn't just study there, he was kind of informally adopted by the Rebbe. So my grandfather had a very close connection to Rabbi Yoel. And again, I can regale you to tons of stories about that relationship. But the one thing I will say is that at the funeral, that I was at Rabbi Yoel's funeral, I'll never forget how my grandfather was roughly about 65 or 70, and he cried at the funeral like a little baby. And that was incredibly impressionistic for a young kid to feel like, wow, he really felt close. And to me, it was, he was his teacher, who also was the Rebbe of thousands of others. There was this deep, intimate connection that my grandfather, among many others, felt. So I would say that Satmar Rebbe was a real core component of my formative years and my formative experiences.
I also grew up knowing of the Satmar Rebbe as having made such an impression on the generation above us, like
Hmm.
you. Um, I really want to try to get a sense of his life story, who he was, that he had such a power over people, that people were so devastated at his passing, that people carried him as such a large part of their lives, but also that people sought him out after the Holocaust and saw in him as a guiding light of restoring their lost world.
Yes. So yeah, absolutely. When thinking about our conversation, I thought that perhaps it would make more sense to kind of divide our conversation, I guess, in three parts. Perhaps talk a little bit about his personal biography, then move into his intellectual biography, and then perhaps you and I will compare notes on the aftermath, where we are on equal footing. So let me just give a brief overview of his very complicated life. It was a very complicated and very challenging life. It was not a simple life. A little bit of dates. I'm sorry if it bores people, but I'm going to try to kind of enhance it with a little bit of more richness, right? He was born in 1887. That's when he was born. He was one of two kids. He only had one other brother. Again, we'll talk about it later, but he was very close to his mom, very close to his mom when he was growing up. At 18, he marries his wife, her name was Chava, and she came also from a very prominent rabbinic family. And they had a very deep, loving relationship. They just grew together, and she had a reputation for being a very, again, from Rebbitzin, a very religious Rebbitzin. But she died very young. She died very young. She died in 1936, which I mix it roughly. I can't do the math so fast. Roughly about 45.
What did she
There
die of?
is, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Now, the legend is that when the ritual bath, which they do for every deceased person before they're buried, and they undress people because they are dipped into a pool. She was wearing tzitzis under her clothing. That's the legend. It's apocryphal. I can't vouch for the story, but whether the story is true or not, it actually is testament to kind of devout person she was. She dies during his lifetime. He has three daughters with him, whom he is also extremely, extremely close with. And tragically, all three of those also died during his lifetime, not during the Holocaust. So that adds to the tragedy. It's not like, oh, the Nazis came in and they killed X amount of Jews, including his three daughters. None of them died during the Holocaust. Each of them died for their own reasons, for their own illnesses. And I do remember my grandfather has vivid memories of one of them died on Friday afternoon, and he gets up at the funeral to eulogize, and he basically just starts crying and says, "There's no way that she died for my sins. She was such a righteous and holy person. Clearly was my fault." And then he started reciting what's called the Yeshamnu, which is basically kind of this acrostic list of sins that people usually cite on Yom Kippur. And he was just crying and crying and enumerating the kind of sins that presumably he did that was the cause for her death. He has three rabbinic positions during this time before the Holocaust. He was in three different cities, and I'm only going to mention the names because there's a funny story. He is first in this town called Arshava, and then he goes to a town that's called Trule, and another one called Satmar. Doesn't matter. I mean, we can get into that, but not for now. The only reason I'm mentioning Satmar is because I have a very funny story for you about that. Satmar is a town in Romania, which originally is called Satamara. Do you want to guess what Satamara means?
The story goes it's named after Saint Mary, supposedly.
Okay. Yes. So the story I grew up with, as you did, was that Satamara is Romanian for Saint Mary. And I don't know if you had it in your family, but my grandfather was such a holy man, but a lot of people in Satmar did that. They wouldn't say Satmar because of the Saint Mary Association, and they said Sakmar. So they replaced the T with a K. So always when my grandfather would talk about Satmar, he would say Sakmar, and like, oh, because you don't want to say Saint Mary. And it was like a beautiful story. I have bad news for you. Very bad news for you. I don't know if you want to hear this. Years ago, I had a Romanian student at our rabbinical school, And I said to him, by the way, my grandfather was Romanian and he grew up in Satmar, but he wouldn't say Satmar because he wouldn't mention St. Mary. And he bursts out laughing and he says, Satamara means a little city in Romanian. It has nothing to do with St. Mary, But then I told him, you know what? I'm not going back to tell my Zaidi. My Zaidi thinks most probably that he's going to get so much Olam Haba for saying Satmar. I'm not ruining it for him. So anyway, so he was a rabbi in those three places. There's a lot of complicated stories about why it is that he kept on changing rabbinic positions. There's a lot of insinuation that he was, a person that was somewhat hard to get along with, and that's why he loses jobs and has to have new jobs. I can't vouch for this story, but that's at least the scholarly claim. Anyway, then he experienced, the Holocaust breaks out. He experiences the Holocaust. He runs around. Again, a lot of stories that we grew up with. I'm sure you grew up with them as well. Eventually, he leaves Nazi Germany with the famous or infamous Castor train. He gets on the train. He gets to Israel. The dream would be for him to stay in Israel, Eretz HaKodesh. It still was the Holy Land. It doesn't work out. Once again, there's a lot of stories, a lot of apocryphal stories why he can't stay there. And that means that he has to confront the reality that he has to go to America. Now, again, we'll talk about this later. For him, America was the land of profanity and impropriety. It was the worst thing that can happen. And that was a reputation that America had for a lot of European Jews. What's interesting about Satmar Rebbe is that Satmar Rebbe had a practice of what's called in Jewish tradition, Tanit Chalom. Tanit Chalom means that if you have a very terrible dream and you are superstitious and you feel, the dream can have consequences, the way to redeem the dream is to fast. And he would fast on a regular basis. He was very superstitious. And he would tell people sometimes, what a dream I had, and I'm so horrified about it. One time he fasted, and people asked him what happened. He said, I dreamt that I'm going to be in America. And that's horrifying.
That's
yes,
how horrifying
exactly.
it was.
Exactly. So for him, America was terrible. But he eventually goes to America. And the rest of it we know. I mean, he comes to America, and somehow he becomes a magnet. He becomes a magnet for thousands of Orthodox Jews, partially because of personality. Counter to what some people might think, he had a very magnetic personality. He could be so warm, loving, and kind that people just gravitated towards him. But also the fact that so many other rebbes were killed by the Nazis meant that a lot of other Hasidim who otherwise would have gone to their rebbes had nowhere to go. So they came to him. And again, as you know, before long, Satmar Hasidus grows exponentially. We can't get into the numbers, and I think it pays to get into the numbers because it's always hard to pin down precise numbers.
Yeah.
But it's enormous. It grows and grows and grows and grows. And then eventually, in 1979, he dies. As I mentioned, I was at the funeral. I will just say a little anecdote. He died during the summer. And I vividly remember that day playing in the outside, and then I came in for a little snack to the bungalow. We were in one of those bungalows, and I
You were
came
in the
to the
country.
bungalow in the country, exactly. And there I see my mother and father crying like little babies. And you can imagine how terrifying it is for an 11-year-old child to see both their parents crying. You imagine the worst right away. And I asked them what happened, and they could barely speak, and they said, Rebbe died. That's how horrifying it was for them. And I think part of the reason was because many Orthodox Jews couldn't believe that Mashiach is not going to come after the Holocaust. They believe that at some point Mashiach will show up and the Rebbe will lead us towards Mashiach. And when that didn't happen, it was this huge dream that was really pulled the rug from underneath, and it was devastating. And then like I said, I was at the funeral, 100,000 people, all of them crying, all of them devastating. Yeah, I think you know him. This person larger than life is Real Glick. Do you remember his Real Glick? Yes, right? So his Real Glick was this larger than life person, physically and behaviorally. And he was Satmar Rebbe's right hand. And I so remember the The opening remark of the funeral was a verse from Tanakh, and basically it was that the heavens defeated the earthlings, and the holy ark was taken captive. And you heard an entire community, 100,000 people, burst out crying because, kind of so to speak, we lost the fight towards the heavenly powers. And that was who he was. That was who he was in terms of his personality. A rich, diverse life, but with a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, but also with a lot of success. I mean, by the time he died, he had thousands and thousands of followers, and all of them who felt very deeply attached to him.
And yet, when he passed away, he had no descendants. He left no children, did he? Was anyone alive?
He only had those 3 daughters. 2 of them died before the Holocaust, and 1 of them survived the Holocaust, but eventually died also at a relatively young age. And again, to exacerbate all the pain and suffering, none of them left him grandchildren. He never had grandchildren. Oh, the one thing that I did leave out, I'm sorry, how could I leave that out? Eventually he remarries. I forgot to mention that.
When does he remarry Alta Faiga?
He marries, so he remarries, actually, I do have the date. He remarried Alta Faiga in 1937.
Oh, before the war.
Yeah, sure. She went through the whole war with him. The marriage was interesting on multiple levels. Again, I think we'll talk later when we talk about aftermath. But I will point out 2 things. First of all, he was Polish, which maybe for outsiders that doesn't, sound so surprising. But for those who know the divisions between Hungarian Jewry and Polish Jewry and Galiciana Jewry and all of that, that was a big surprise that a Hungarian Jew marries a Polish woman. That's number one. She also came from big rabbinic royalty. And the other thing is that if I remember correctly, she was 25 years younger than him, which, as you can imagine, because he was hoping to start a family with her. That unfortunately didn't happen. They never had children. And again, entering into gossip territory, the one surviving daughter that was alive while he married for the second time ended up having an incredibly complicated relationship with the second wife, to the point where legend has it that towards the end of the daughter's life, she couldn't come to see her father. So
I see. Really?
Yeah.
I do know that her passing and her life was filled with rumor and gossip, of which I didn't hear the details, but I did know that people were talking. But it's really hard for me to even grasp that this man who was at the lead of revitalizing a community that is so children focused, that is so much about the children and the grandchildren and the Doides Yeshudim, the generations that may come, didn't leave any grandchildren. Did he speak of how he coped with that?
Yeah, so that's another interesting thing. He was a very private person. I am not aware of. Let me back up for a minute. Posthumously, a lot of books have been written about him. Most of them hagiographic, meaning people who admire him anyway and believe that he's flawless. And it's mostly kind of hagiographic stories. It's not critical, but they're still informative to a degree, as long as you can, see through the kind of outer hagiographic layer. He was a very private person. He was terribly OCD. In many ways, he was obsessed with cleanliness. By the time, he went to bed, he most probably went through 2 or 3 changings of clothing. Kind of weird thing about him is that he was obsessed with bodily cleanliness, particularly when it came to prayers. And in the mornings, and again, this is a little bit kind of not so comfortable to share, but still it gives you an insight to who he was as a human being. He spent a significant amount of time in the bathroom, making sure that his body is really cleansed, so that when he davens, his body is clean, because there's some kind of legal halachic requirement for that. But consequently, he never davened the morning prayers before 12:01 in the afternoon, which again, as a Rebbe, he can get away with it, but it is part of the insight to this complex personality who had hang-ups and, He was a human being, like others,
Yeah.
but it was not well known. In fact, the whole, so to speak, I mean, the bathroom thing somehow was well known, and it somehow was presented as laudatory and complimentary, like, "Whoa, the Rebbe's so holy that look how much time he spends before davening." But then the other parts, the fact that he was obsessed with the changes of clothing and all of that, that was not so well known.
I often feel like I get very overwhelmed by the details of his stringencies, and it's hard for me to understand what else was going on with this incredibly larger than life figure. Something that I heard about was that he had a great sense of humor. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, he was
He was not as
I
funny as other funny.
no, 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 that's not what it was. I mean, that too, that too. He was more, yeah, he was more cynical and could kind of, say a funny critical observation of someone that he didn't agree with. I mean, I don't want to burden your listeners with a very prominent example of that sense of humor slash cynicism because it's very kind of insiderish.
I
But there's a
see.
lot of those stories that he knew how to. I know I'm going to say a Yiddish word because you told me not to, but I'll translate it. He knew how to give a good stuff, like a good insult that
I
hit
see.
home, that kind of made people laugh, but also think, wow, that was harsh. And he was very good at it, very good at it. And he made it sound like, what's a big deal? I just made a joke.
He liked to do it
uh,
at secular Jews. No, he liked the little jab at secular
anybody,
Jews.
anybody. I mean, I will. And that's just it's very conflicted because you and I talked about this yesterday. I have great, respect and reverence for him. He was so formative in my life. He had such an influence on my life, but I also matured and recognized that he was a complicated person. So I'm always worried. On the one hand, I want to give a full picture. On the other hand, um, I don't want to
Yeah.
be too bashful. I mean, one of the examples, and we'll get to that later, is that he was so opposed to Zionism and he wrote a book about it. And then he was surprised that it was not as impactful as he would like it to be. And then there was one particular person that he thought would kind of really be swayed by his book, but he wasn't. And it was a Hasidic Rebbe. Um, but he didn't have a reputation, that person, for being the biggest scholar. So Satmar Rebbe once said, when he was disappointed that the person didn't kind of, wasn't influenced by his arguments, he said, "Oh, you know what? I think the problem is that my book didn't have punctuation. It was too difficult for the guy to read." And
It
if
was
I would
his
have
fault.
told, exactly, but and if I would have told the audience, it would have been even more interesting because he was one of the most prominent rabbis of his time. So
I
he
see.
was, yeah, his jokes was more cynical and hit the point. So
I remember my brother telling me one nighttime we're in pajamas, we're chatting, and he told me some story about a miracle. I grew up with miracle stories being the definition of Hasidism. Whatever you meant by Hasidic studies that Lubavitch is famous for, we didn't think of that as Hasidism. Stories of miracles of rabbis believing in them, repeating them. That was to me the core of what it meant to be Hasidic. I think that is fair to say. So we would hear stories in school all the time. We'd hear stories at the Shabbos table. We'd hear stories at home. And one day my brother tells me a story of a miracle that happened in the woods, so on and so forth. I don't even know if I'm remembering it correctly, but that's the memory that I'm carrying with me in life. But the Satmar Rabbi said, this is a beautiful miracle story. The only problem is, if you think about it, there are no survivors. So how do you know it actually happened?
right,
So the
right.
essence of the story was doubting a miracle story, which was heretical.
I was going to move into kind of his intellectual biography, and we can do it out of whatever we talked about. He intellectual. Well, let me say first a kind of a background, a bit of data. He was an incredible scholar, Jewishly, very scholarly. And why is that important? It's important because, first of all, just to know that he was very scholarly. And secondly, because once again, it fits in with the narrative that at least I try to share, which is when people talk about Hasidic rabbis, they don't that often mention traditional scholarship, Hasidic Rebbe's, more often than not, when we talk about them, we talk about, again, like you said, either their prayer or their miracles and so on and so forth. It's not that often. Obviously, there are exceptions to the rule, but it's not that often that traditional scholarship is an attribute that people associate with him. So that's number one. He wrote a tremendous amount of halachic responsa that just covers the gamut of Jewish law, whether it's marriage issues, whether it's issues having to do with kosher and so on and so forth. So that's just kind of background information. His two obsessions, and hopefully we can share our conversations, because I think one of them I had more exposure, and the other one I think you must probably be more privy to how that played itself out. But his two obsessions was, so to speak, Zionism and sexual impropriety. Those are the two things that he obsessed about, constantly talked about it, wrote 2 books on the issue. Again, evidence to my thesis. How many Hasidic Rebbes do you know who write books, who write Svarim? There are books from them of, Friday night discourses that they shared, or Shabbos morning discourses, but there are no books of Rebbes who wrote tomes developing a thesis and all that. He wrote 2 books articulating his argument against Zionism, which I'll discuss perhaps if we have time. Briefly, he was a very traditional theologian. What I mean by that is that I'm not going to speak for you, but I'm going to speak for myself, right? When I hear tragedy, it doesn't pose any theological challenge for me. The world is a chaotic place and terrible things happen. A colleague of mine just lost their nephew in the war in Gaza. I don't think that the 19-year-old nephew, deserved to die, but it doesn't one iota challenge my theology, because the world is a crappy place. Sorry if I'm a rabbi. I forgot I can't say that word. But the world is a horrible place. Satmar Rebbe, like most traditional Jews, was a quid pro quo theologian, right? For him, things happen for a reason. Right? God is really omnipotent. God is omniscient. God knows everything that happens. God has all the power in the world to intervene. If he wanted to intervene, he would have stopped Hitler from killing the 6 million people. The only reason God didn't do it, according to Satmar Rebbe, based on very traditional theology. It's not like Satmar Rebbe is an outcast on this, by the way. That's actually very classic theology. It must have been for a reason. He searched and looked, and turns out that the rabbis in the Talmud ascribe horrific punishment for preempting the Messiah. If you preempt the Messiah, if you take a state, if you declare Jewish sovereignty prior to the coming of Messiah, the language in the Talmud is, you will be huntable like the deer in the woods. So for Satmar Rebbe, ergo, Zionism is horrible. Zionism is terrible. Zionism is outrageous. And for him, we can't reject the punishment of exile. God wants us to be in exile for our sins. Only God can say, guys, time to leave. You've paid your dues. You're ready to leave. And he was obsessed with that. He couldn't stop talking about it. Now, what's interesting, and that brings me to the point that I wanted to say, is that the fact that secular Jews didn't listen to him didn't bother him so much, because they don't care about traditional halakhic Judaism. Why would they listen to what he says about what's allowed and not allowed halakhically? But the religious Zionists was devastating. The fact that there are people who identify as observant, as halakhic, as part of the classical Jewish tradition, and still they support the notion of Jewish sovereignty prior to the Messiah. I think of one of the most prominent Orthodox supporters of the state of Israel, right? Who comes to mind? The rabbi with a big spudik, right? Rav Kook, right?
Oh.
Like, that was so jarring to him. How could such a holy rabbi believe in something so outrageous? Now, what distinguishes Rav Kook? When people see Rav Kook, given the 2 camps within ultra-Orthodoxy, where do you place Rav Kook? In the Hasidic camp, right? He's not Litvish. He's Hasidic. He's a descendant of Hasidic rabbis, and so on and so forth. And that's true for a bunch of other Hasidic Rebbes. The Belzer Rebbe was not sufficiently anti-Zionist. The Vishnitzer Rebbe was not sufficiently anti-Zionist. Now, how is that? What's the explanation for that? Why is it that Satmar Rebbe here makes a halakhic argument against Zionism, and yet they don't think that a Orthodox Jew needs to be anti-Zionist? And the answer is because Hasidut has a antinomian component to it. Antinomian means they believe that, in certain circumstances, we break the law to hold the law. Right? The idea that sometimes we don't understand God's ways, and sometimes God condones rebellion against halacha for the greater good. And that was their justification for a state prior to when God allows it. And that was so devastating to him. These people use my Hasidic heritage to justify what I think is one of the most outrageous sins. And he tried and tried. That's why he wrote books. He met with these Rabbeim. They wouldn't listen to him. And that's when he said one of the most shocking lines in his biography. And it's 3 words in Hebrew and I'll translate. He said, Nishtakha Torat HaBaal Shem Tov. We forgot what the Baal Shem Tov stood for. In other words, you guys claim
So the Baal Shem
the Baal
Tov,
Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidut, as the justification for your anti-halachic stance. You don't know what the heck you're talking about. We don't know what the Baal Shem Tov stood for. And as a result, he also stopped identifying as a Hasidic Rebbe theologically. Now, again, like I said, he doesn't take off his Bekisha, he doesn't take off his Primal. He still has what's called a Tish, right? Friday night, the Hasidim gather to share the meal with him. The externals still are there, but the internals, the philosophy, the theology is no longer Hasidic. In fact, as I said before, he becomes buddies with someone like Rav Aaron Kotler, the head of the Lutvish Yeshiva in Lakewood, with Rav Reuven Gruzovsky, the head of Beit Midrash Elyon, another Litvish Yeshiva in Muncie. And that becomes they become his colleagues, and the Hasidim become his nemesis. And as a result, he just rejected a lot of Hasidic stuff. And that goes back to what we started, which is he had zero patience for Hasidic stories. Like, why are you wasting your time with that? This is all silly. This is all Narishkeiten. And the best example that he used to give always, if I can share with you for a minute, is that there was a Rebbe, Reb Merel Apter. Reb Merel Apter was a Hasidic Rebbe who lived in a town called Apta, which I think is in Poland. Do you know where Reb Merel Apter is buried?
No, where?
In Tveria, in Israel.
In Israel.
Tiberias. How does that work? So the Hasidic legend is that Reb Merel Apter always wanted to be buried in Eretz HaKodesh, in the Holy Land of Israel. Hasidim forgot about it. He dies, and they bury him in the cemetery in Poland. But in heaven, they knew the Rebbe's real will. So God sends 2 angels who dig up the grave,
Carry
and
his
take
body.
out Meir's body and fly all the way to Tveria to bury him. But they arrive in Tveria in the middle of the night, and the door to the cemetery is locked. So they wake up the guard who's in charge of the cemetery. He opens the cemetery, they bury him, and the next morning they see a new grave. Evidence that Reb Merel Apter is indeed buried in Tiberias. And then Satmar Rebbe would say, wait, these malachim can fly from Poland to Tveria,
Malachim
but they
are
cannot skip
angels.
the gate of the angels can fly, exactly, can fly all the way from Poland to Israel, but the gate of the cemetery they couldn't hop over. They had to go ask the guard to open the door. What are you talking about? And he loved to tell that story. Like, look how silly and stupid these stories were. So he really, at the end, felt hugely disappointed, hugely cheated, because this was so important for him. And to his credit, he also believed that, counter to what traditional Zionism, at least Orthodox Zionism, claims, that the phrase is Reshit Smichat Gi'ilateinu, the state is the beginning of the flourishing of the redemption. He actually thought it was the biggest obstacle to the redemption. So not only was he not in favor of Zionism, he actually thought we suffer more because of Zionism. But he became obsessed with it. He couldn't stop talking about it.
Am I hearing you say that his cynicism towards Hasidic stories, these legends, and also
Mhm.
his rejection of Hasidic theology was prompted by Zionism, which was so alienating to him of religious Zionists that to the point that he rejected what they stood for.
And I have nothing to say other than, yeah, yeah.
Uh-huh.
In fact, the source, the quote that I just mentioned before, "Nishtakha Torah Baal Shem Tov," we no longer remember what the Baal Shem Tov stood for. Now, that alone tells you everything, right? The Baal Shem Tov is not the founder of Hasidut. The Baal Shem Tov is not famous for sophisticated, intricate halakhic ideas, right? He's famous for a very creative theology. So exactly what he says is rejecting that theology, and that's written in his poem, in his, I think, 500-page tome in which he explains why he thinks that Zionism is wrong. So there's the direct correlation between him feeling, if it wasn't for the fact that these Hasidic Rebbe's have adopted a Hasidic theology, which allows them to embrace something that is so obviously against halakha, they would have all agreed with him. And the fact that they didn't, to him, is evidence of the flaw of Hasidic theology. And therefore he was out. And that brings me back to what I said before. That's why Chabad was so attractive, because if you look for intellectual Hasidut in Satmar, you wouldn't find it. You would find intellectual traditional learning, like Litvish learning was very prominent. But Hasidut was not. I mean, there was no room in the curriculum even for studying Hasidut because he was so disappointed. And there's also a lot of cynical stories about that. But I want
Yeah,
to spare his reputation a little bit.
I actually grew up knowing that we are very far from the Baal Shem Tov. That's what we were taught, that today's generation of Hasidim are completely different from the Baal Shem Tov. And when I started to experience the world beyond Satmar, I found out that outsiders impose a narrative on Hasidim, including on Satmar, of the Baal Shem Tov being the central figure and you're dancing, which wasn't what I had experienced. And this emphasis on the Baal Shem Tov and his teachings seemed to me to not resonate with what I was taught. This kind of, well, nowadays we're completely different from the Baal Shem Tov.
Because you didn't grow up in a Hasidic community.
I didn't go, wow, this is the most radical thing that has been discussed on my channel to date.
I'm sorry. I've been called a heretic a lot of times, but not for this.
No. It's always the frontier.
I want to stress, I know I'm repeating myself. If you're looking for external descriptions of Hasidus, find it in Satmar. But when it gets to the more sophisticated aspect, the theology, the philosophy, he wanted to have none of it.
Can you say in just briefly what you mean by Hasidic theology, besides for the legends and the stories of miracles around rabbis?
Right. So I mean, I feel worse than Hillel. Hillel has a convert that comes to him and tells him, "Teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot. You want me to teach you all Hasidut on one foot?"
I know. Briefly.
I think exactly. So I think two pieces that I would say are kind of the kernels of Hasidut. First of all, Hasidut believes in a God that is hyper immanent, meaning we normally, if superficial, if you ask people, "Where's God?" God is out there in the heavens, the transcendent God. God is outside of the universe and all of that. And Hasidut, based on Kabbalistic teaching that preceded them, embraces a very robust immanence, which means God actually permeates the universe. God permeates the world. You have a spark of God. I have a spark of God. Everything has a spark of holiness, right? Which is why they're so much more joyful, because we're all, a manifestation of the divinity. That's why there's so much about love for the other Jew, because the other Jew has, a divine spark in them. And so on and so forth. So much of Hasidic behavior is informed by the theology of immanence. That's number one. And number two, as I said before, and I don't want to overstate it, I know that if scholars watch this video, I'm going to get beat up. So I want to caution that. There is a modicum, there is a degree of antinomianism in Hasidut. What do I mean by that? I'll give you a very silly, small example. Hasidim are famous for davening late. Well, what do you mean? You can't daven past the set time that halakha determines. Why do they daven late? Oh, because davening with the proper intentions and with the proper mindset trumps this halachic requirement of being stuck with 9:31 and 40 seconds, right? So those are mini examples. Then you have something like Zionism, which is antinomianism writ large. The Rebbe shows you halachically you can't go and have Jewish sovereignty prior to the Messiah. And then the Hasidic Rebbe comes along and says, I know all these sources, but I do believe that God sometimes works in mysterious ways, notwithstanding that it's in conflict with traditional Jewish law. If you're a Chassid, you're like, "Oh, yes, of course, praise God has his own ways, and we have to embrace that." Right? Which is why Rav Kook becomes so obsessed with Zionism. If you're a halakhic Jew, this is horrifying to you. There is nothing above the law, let alone God. God can transcend his own law. It's horrifying to him. And for Satmar Rebbe, this was devastating for him to hear that Rebbes could embrace a theology which says, you know what? Sometimes we break the law to enhance the law.
I want to talk a little more about this antinomianism because I'm about to publish a video where I interview Ayala Fader, who's a professor who wrote a book about people who live double lives. It's titled Hidden Heretics, Jewish Doubt in the Digital Age. And it's about people who don't believe or have lost a degree of faith in the community they were born into or that they live in. And instead of acting out their life-changing doubt, they stay and they hide what they truly believe. And what she talks about there is that there are Rebbes, there are experts, there are therapists who will encourage people who lost faith to continue to pretend and live with what we might call hypocrisy. They would hide it or make compromises. If you're married to someone who lost faith, look the other way or get on with each other anyway. And I haven't published it yet, but I have a feeling that people are going to have a really hard time with this. And I have a really hard time explaining why this makes sense to me intuitively, that as a self-preservation mechanism, there would be an ask for people to put aside what they believe and live in contrast to what they believe. So the question I was getting to in a rather roundabout way was, is it related to the antinomianism that gives this society room for people to often live with such contradictions that I think to other people would be heretical, would be fakery?
Right,
it's a hard
right.
question,
So,
is it?
No, not a hard question at all. So notwithstanding generalizations. So I'm going to generalize, and I understand that it is generalizations, and obviously there are nuances and distinctions and so on and so forth. But I think, Ms. Robbie, you can back it up, and Ms. Robbie can testify to that even better than me, that a lot has changed over the years in terms of Haredi parents' attitude towards deviant children, so to speak, right? Towards kids who reject their upbringing and become less religious or not religious at all, right? And there's been a tremendous evolution, right? When I was growing up, if someone left, it was very rare that the parents would still embrace them, would still, let them come home and still, treat them as their own children. Things have changed significantly. I think that I'm right in saying that the change is far greater in the Hasidic community than there is in the Litvish community. It's more common among Hasidic parents to, over the years, have come to terms with the fact that, you know what, I'm going to embrace my child in spite of the fact that they're not so religious, in spite of the fact that they're not doing what I want. And I think partially it is a offshoot of the antinomianism, meaning there is room to accept that one can serve God, notwithstanding that what they're doing is not necessarily in conformity with the intricacies of halakha. So my answer is that yes, there is a lot of subconscious ability to embrace that which flies in the face of your beliefs, but is less so true for a Litvish parent. And again, I know it's a generalization, but I do think my impressionistic observation, which I think could be borne out by scientific research, is that the speed and the degree of evolution on this issue is far greater in the Hasidic community and the Litvish community.
I've also had that sense, just to say that, my unscientific observation as well. I want to go back to the anti-Zionist issue, which is mind-boggling. Why was it such an important topic for the Satmar Rebbe? I have two questions. My first question that I want to talk about is something I've already posed to David Beal, and I don't feel like the Professor David Beal, who I had on an interview as well, and I feel like there's more to explore on the topic. If the Satmar Rebbe is right, that it says okay, let me rephrase it. If it says in the Talmud that you're not allowed to return to the land before the time, how do other Orthodox Zionists respond to the Shula Shvius, or what's called the Three Oaths, that is so foundational for the Satmar Rabbi?
There's an expression, a yeshiva bacher expression, which is "Shalach safafam tzatzi tshuva." A smart question has half of the answer. I think you said it. If you think about your question, you said, "How come something that it says in the Talmud is not universally accepted?" And that's the answer. Satmar Rebbe was right to point that the Talmud makes the three oaths, one of which is adopting sovereignty prior to the arrival of the Messiah, very explicit in the Talmud. But guess what? If you open up the Shulchan Aruch, the book of the code, Jewish code, law, there's no mention of that. So we now have two camps, right? You have on the one hand the Satmar Rebbe camp, which says, okay, I'll try to find an answer for why it was not codified, for why it didn't make its way into the book of codes, the Shulchan Aruch, but it's explicit in the Gemara. To which the opposition said, well, we don't cite law by the Talmud. The Talmud is a book of Jewish discourse, of Jewish ideas. If it becomes codified, that means that it was an accepted opinion. But we all know that there are quite a few opinions in the Talmud that have been rejected over the years. And guess what? This is one of them. So that's argument number one. So the second argument is the following. As you mentioned, there are three oaths. I'm not going to get into the third, but one is don't go to Israel before the time. Two is an oath, or an oath is a funny word here. It's basically a warning with the power of an oath, right? That's really what it is. So the second one actually was given to the nations, to the other nations, not to the Jewish nation. And it was, don't oppress the Jews disproportionately. Okay? So Satmar Rebbe said, okay, they're bums. They didn't listen to it. They killed 6 million of us, and they're going to get their due diligence at the appropriate time. Others said, no, these two are intertwined. We're bound by A if they keep their part of the arrangement. The moment they broke their piece of the arrangement and they oppressed us disproportionately, so to speak, we're free. Then there is one last thing, which is that there is a source that says that this oath of staying in exile until Messiah comes was only meant for the first 1,000 years that we were exiled. Once the 1,000 years are over, we can go back. Again, some people say, look, that source is dispositive, and now we can go. And Satmar Rebbe said, well, who the heck is that source? It's one source, and it's not binding. So at the end of the day, if you would say to me, Yisachar, I want to interview you and help me make the anti-Zionist argument, I will tell you, sure, here is a solid, tight argument against Zionism. If you said to me, Yisachar, actually, I want you to argue the opposing point, I can give you just as well a solid, airtight argument. My point is, nobody won this war. Each side has very powerful arguments on their side. And in fact, I'll say one last thing about that. Let me actually see if I can bring up that slide, because it's actually very funny. That's funny. I mean, very informative. This person is not Satmar Rebbe. This person is a rabbi by the name of Yisachar Shlomo Teichtal.
Yeah.
Yisachar Shlomo Teichtal, as he looks, was a chassid. Both of them pre-war, Satmar Rebbe and this rabbi, were anti-Zionist. And then 6 million Jews are annihilated. And both of them asked the question, what could explain something so enormous, something so devastating? And you know what, Frida? They end up at opposite ends of the spectrum. Satmar Rebbe says pro-Zionism is sufficient explanation, and Rabbi Teichtal ends up with the conclusion insufficient Zionism is the explanation. So here you have people with the same background, the same tradition, same questions, and for one of them the answer is you were too Zionist, and for the other one the answer is you're insufficiently Zionist. And you know what's even more interesting? If you compare the books, and this is a copy of the cover page of this rabbi's book, he wrote a very prominent book, Pro-Zionism. I would say 80% of the sources are the same that the Satmar Rebbe uses and he uses. They're talking about the same text, the same sources, the same authoritative references, but that's the beauty, if you like Torah learning, or the frustration about Torah learning, that it's very rarely clean, neat, and careful. So if you asked me, perhaps I'm not the right person to say that, who won the debate, I would say that neither side won the debate. Nobody came up with this positive, definitive, answers that were knockouts.
I see. That would be your as a rabbi, your official opinion that there's no superseding.
I mean, as someone who has studied both sources, I know what I am. I mean, again, don't get me wrong, I identify as Zionist actually I know this is a Yiddish word, I'll translate it, but I think I'll make the point better. I'm a Verbrennte Zionist. I'm a very passionate Zionist myself. So I obviously find the other side more compelling, but those are for secondary reasons and whatever. But objectively, I don't know anybody who can come along and say, oh, wow, Satmar Rebbe won the debate, or the anti-Satmar Rebbe won the debate. Both of them have very strong, compelling arguments. And that, by the way, is the nature of all the big questions in Judaism, right? If we were to discuss, what bracha to make on potatoes, yeah, I can tell you right away, that's an easy one. But the moment you kind of zoom out from these small ones and you get to the big ones, it's much more complex because so many additional variables come into play.
I did a video about my Satmar Hasidic education, and I didn't prepare for it. I just pulled out some schoolwork and I looked through it, and I was absolutely floored to find that in 6th grade we had a curriculum on anti-Zionism, multiple pages. I had no memory of it, and it wasn't about the 3 oaths, which is what most people talk about when we talk about anti-Zionism. There was no mention of the 3 oaths at all. It was all about the fact that Zionists were trying to pull religious Jews away from the holy path, that they were trying to mashanazan, to change what was sacred, and that the Satmar Rebbe created by Sruchel, our school, in order to create an alternative that does preserve what is holy. So the entire basis of the anti-Zionism lesson I had in my 6th grade curriculum was on Zionists being a corruption of sacred religious life. I'm wondering if that might be a part of what was so motivating the Satmar Rebbe's rejection of Zionism, that it ran so deep for him.
What do you mean by this?
The threat of assimilation that was seen as coming from Zionists.
Right. Yeah. No. Again, very important point. Thank you for raising it. 2 things I'll say very quickly is that number one, to use a poor analogy, when a fire breaks out in one's home, they throw everything at it, they throw the coats, and if it doesn't work, they throw water, and if not, they use the fire extinguisher. I think Satmar Rebbe tried out everything. He's like, he was going to bring halachic arguments, he's going to bring theological arguments, he's going to bring sociological arguments, and he does all of that, right? I mean, in the book, in the Sefer that he wrote against Zionism, he runs the gamut of, like I said, halachic, legal, theological, sociological, and so on and so forth. So that's number one. He just threw everything in the kitchen sink on this fire. The more interesting thing about this question is that, in theory, Satmar Rebbe used to say always, would have happened if the state would have been run by the greatest righteous people, by the greatest tzaddikim in the world? Would I still be opposed? And he said, absolutely. It's not about the lack of religiosity of the, you know, leadership of Zionism, of the thinkers of Zionism. It is the ethos. The Zionistic ethos is um, incompatible with halachic and observant Judaism. But that argument was a little bit harder to make because a his proofs were not dispositive. That's number one. And number two, let's remember, you're talking to people who suffered a Holocaust, who want to know that there is a redemption, and the state provided some comfort to those horrors. I said, okay, yeah, there was a Holocaust, but now we have sovereignty. And I don't want to make the, linkage here. That's a whole nother conversation, whether people linked the state to the Holocaust or not. And that's a tough question to make. Like, 6 million died, so we would have a state. But even if there's no linkage, the state offers some comfort. Listen, seems like God abandoned us and let 6 million die, but maybe things have changed now. We have sovereignty, we have independence, we have a state, and so on and so forth. So people emotionally had this tremendous opposition to his vehement anti-Zionism. So that's when the Frumkeit, the assimilation, comes into play, where he says, okay, I hear you. If only the leadership was religious and halachic and observant, perhaps I would have gone along with that. But look, I don't even need to use the legal argument. Look what they're doing to Judaism. They're corrupting Judaism. They're embracing culturation, I should say. And then I think in the back of your mind, you have the Yaldei Teiman, right? The kids who were brought from Yemen, who supposedly were stolen from their parents. Not clear the scholarly opinion on that is divided, but at least we grew up with that. They stole children and they cut off their locks and they really made them non-religious. And I think that he hoped that will fly and will have much broader acceptance. So I think that, this is going to sound so awful. I think for the Meidlach, for the girls, they kind of sold the softer argument that is much more easily to understand. It's about the non-Judaism, the non-religious aspect of it. But I think that deeply, kind of internally, he argued repeatedly that it wouldn't matter. If Moshe Rabbeinu was the prime minister of Israel, he still would have been opposed to it.
So let's talk about the most controversial part of his anti-Zionism, which was being rescued from the Nazi clutches by a train organized by Zionists, the famous Kastner train.
Right. There's nothing to talk about. Really nothing to talk about. It is a big question. It's looming heavily over his biography. Right. On the one hand, he believes that Zionism is so, I was going to use a strong word, despicable. Despicable maybe is too strong, but Zionism is so antithetical to halacha. And he uses language that suggests that you cannot in any way derive any form of benefit or pleasure or release from Zionism, right? And he has halachic terminology for that. The Hereg Val Yavor, which I don't want to get into, translate really high-level legal terminology to suggest how severe it is to take advantage of anything associated with Zionism. And yet, he gets out of the Nazi clutches by a train that's organized by the Zionists. And it is a big, I don't know if there is a good answer. Perhaps you've heard a good answer. If you know one, let me know. When we were growing up, we were told that he got out with a Kastner train, but they left out the Zionist piece. But that's something that I find anybody who wants to talk about Satmar Rebbe outside of the conference of Satmar, at the end, they need to answer for that. And as far as I know, there's no good answer.
So first of all, I found this toy train in a store. I told you about this before because it captured my fancy so much. All Hasidic toys interest me, but it was sold right before the anniversary of the Satmar Rabbi's rescue, which is annually celebrated with a big get-together called Kuf Aleph Kislev. and they sold this toy train that had the song traditionally sung for Kafal Kislev that it played. Do you know what? What do you think? What do you think? That's exactly it.
Of course I know.
It's so funny.
Of course.
It's like a song has been adopted for that day. So you press a button on the train and it sings B'chu Batchi.
That's hilarious.
Yes.
Oh my God. I want to get it too. I'll try to get it.
And it has
I'm actually going to Borough Park today. I'll try to buy it.
I don't know.
Go
It might have. It might be a collectible. I always buy stuff thinking, yeah, I might not have the money to buy it, but maybe it's going to be a collectible.
Exactly.
I'm
One
hoping
day you'll
you can
recuperate
find
all
it.
the expenses.
Yeah. Anyway, so in the back it had the story of the Satmar Rebbe's rescue, and it said actually that Kastner was a Zionist, but that the reason Kastner saved the Satmar Rebbe, despite being a Zionist, it actually explicitly says that Kastner only wanted to rescue his cronies and his Zionist cronies. And the reason that he rescued the Satmar Rebbe, or he allowed Satmar Rebbe to be one of the rescued on the train, because so many, of course, didn't make it onto the train and perished, was because his father-in-law, Dr. Fisher, had a dream where he was threatened that the entire train would be off if the Satmar Rebbe wouldn't be on the train. And plus, money was paid. Good money was paid to Kastner to get the Satmar Rabbi on the train. So that was the official narrative. But I think there is also a controversy around Kastner's role in rescuing some and not the others, which was the subject of a book and a documentary I recently watched, and a trial, exactly, and a trial in Israel, which I suppose it's all very difficult. To be honest, even as I try to talk to you about it, I feel like I can't say words because to me it feels like such a hard subject to talk about. Ultimately, so many people died in this terrible, terrible tragedy, and it feels so out of place to litigate it for us that weren't there. And the Satmar Rebbe lost his community. He ultimately, everyone, survivors and not, were victims of having lost so much.
Yeah, no, I couldn't have said it better. In theory, it's a big question. In practice, it gets a bit more complicated. I mean, what would you have done? Not you. What would anybody else have done when their theory somehow becomes so real? And the question is, will you die or not? Is it a defense? Yeah, it's complicated. It's very complicated. Yeah. And let he who has not sinned throw the first stone, if I may quote that book. I mean, we all have our shortcomings and our weak spots where we don't live up to our ideals.
Yeah.
Again, some people would say, but that's a Rebbe, and a Rebbe is different.
Some people also say that he's a Rebbe and he had to be saved because it wasn't just about saving himself; it was about saving his flock.
Yep. All of that. So it's complicated. But then again, we're talking about a very complicated person, so it's surprising. Yeah.
So let's talk about, do you want to talk anything else about his intellectual life that you feel is very important? Oh, of course. Okay, let's talk about his focus. Would you call it sexual impropriety or was it modesty? I would say modesty.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Hebrew term for that would be kedusha, which is sanctity. And under the rubric of sanctity, there's modesty. There's this obsession about sexual impropriety, particularly as it manifests itself about men and their own private, personal sexual behavior. But I think it would be kind of kedusha would be the term, which was his second crusade. Either he crusaded against Zionism or crusaded about kedusha. And he was obsessed about it. I think you can speak to it much better than I do and than I could, because it mostly impacted the women and all the demands that he made on women. I will just say 2-3 things that, interestingly enough, this is a person who had so much energy that he can fight 2 crusades simultaneously. And, people know the Zionist piece very much. They know a lot less about the Kedusha piece, but it was an obsession of his just as much. And just one little tidbit, and then I want to hear from you because you know it better. I want you to want to know. is that it led to huge fights once again with a lot of contemporaries, particularly Moshe Feinstein. So Moshe Feinstein is one of the most prominent poskim of his time, most prominent rabbis of his time. And he has three big fights with Moshe Feinstein. Briefly, just one of them is the question of whether milk needs to have has to have a rabbinic supervision, or you can drink milk even if it doesn't have the rabbinic supervision. Moshe Feinstein said it's okay. Satmar Rebbe was vehemently opposed. The other question was the height of the mechitza, the wall that divides the men and women's section in shul. Moshe Feinstein said it's enough if it's a certain amount, even if the people can see each other. It's not about seeing each other. It's about a symbolic separation. And then the last one, which was the most vehement one, was the question of artificial insemination. What happens with a woman who struggles with infertility? Can she be artificially inseminated? Moshe Feinstein said yes, and Satmar Rebbe went crazy about this and really went all out against one of the most prominent rabbis of his time. But the common denominator is sanctity, holy milk that has a proper supervision, walls that separate women from men to the point where they don't see each other, and no woman is inseminated by sperm other than her own husband. So that was one aspect of it. And the other aspect is the demands of women, which I think you can talk about much better than I could.
For a second, about artificial insemination. Artificial insemination is just the fertilization of an egg outside of its natural conception, right? Yeah. It doesn't necessarily mean someone else.
So at his time, when he was talking about it, it was talking about people. It was mostly cases where the infertility was the result of the husband's inability to impregnate the wife, and the question is, can you use other people's sperm to get a wife pregnant? And for the Satmar Rebbe, this was akin to infidelity. You're not having. Yeah, go ahead.
And this remains the ruling for Satmar that
I always have this kind of subversive line in which I say there's no such thing as modern orthodoxy and ultra orthodoxy. Everybody's modern orthodox is just fast modern orthodox and slow modern orthodox. Satmar evolves too. It's ridiculous to think that Satmar is stuck where they were 30, 40 years or even 20 years ago. Things evolve. When I was a kid, everybody followed Satmar Rebbe's opinion. If you're struggling with infertility, there's really nothing to do, especially if the cause is the husband. And in fact, I have a very close friend, my father's friend, who never had kids because they relied on Satmar Rebbe's psak. Modernity has penetrated the community, and people have workarounds, and Satmar Rebbe did not win that war, let's just say.
I see. Interesting. Very interesting.
I don't have more to say about it, but the short answer is that he did not win that war. And like every community, when modernity and halacha comes into conflict, you find ways to maneuver that. And Satmar is no different. And, the community changes like every other community.
Interesting.
But you tell me, you are a woman, and you were at the receiving end of the most explicit manifestation of this obsession with Kedusha, because he had these crazy ideas about women's dress and women's behavior. So tell me, I've never been at the receiving end of that.
Oh man, now I'm feeling the spotlight on me, and I'm not sure that I can properly deliver. Well, I do have something that it's sort of an interest of mine, so I wanted to present you this, which is the stockings that were created by the Satmar Rabbi. This is palm stockings. Palm is the word for Teitelbaum, which is the name of the Satmar Rebbe's family name, and it's the name of the Satmar dynasty. So this, from what I was taught, was that the Satmar Rebbe commissioned the Brach family to make stockings that were sufficiently thick, and the Brach family named the stockings palm after Teitelbaum. Although, as far as we always understood, the Satmar Rabbi had no financial investment in this venture. It was simply for him a need that the students in his schools, the women from his community, should wear stockings thicker than what was sold by generic companies. So when we went through this rite of passage of going into high school or going into 8th grade, it kept shifting. We changed stockings from blue stockings to palm stockings, and that meant we were grown up. And I think when I think about the question you posed to me about what the Satmar Rebbe's concern with impropriety or with modesty was, I think of the palm stockings, because we were taught in school that the Satmar Rebbe was very, very, very concerned that women should only wear very thick stockings. So I didn't experience it as sexual impropriety because we weren't talking about sex. We were talking about the importance of women dressing modestly by his standards of sufficient modesty. And we were definitely taught that in school. Before the high holidays, teachers would give moving lectures that were supposed to inspire us, and they would quote from Satmar Rebbe and his clothing. And it's fascinating to me that there was a clothing item named after him. To this day, it fascinates me. But that's really
But
the
you
extent.
left out one thing. You left out one thing. It had to be thick, but also needed something else.
Oh, needed a seam.
The most important piece.
It has
Right?
microfiber with seam.
Mhm.
So it comes in 2 deniers of thickness, right? 170. You know more than me. Why did you ask me?
No. The only reason I'll tell it is because the kind of irony of it is that many, if not most, if not all of Satmar women still do that. And it is the most attention-drawing thing that a woman could ever wear. If anybody walks down the street in Manhattan and sees a woman who has seams sticking out of her stockings, like, okay,
Really?
that sounds interesting. Oh, totally. I mean, I don't want to be more graphic, but actually,
now
it
I'm
has
thinking I'm going to start to
pretty
wear
negative
this.
associations. Exactly. It has actually
Now
very
I want to
negative
wear this.
associations. No, but really, think about a woman today walking on the street in Manhattan with
With a
thick
seam.
stockings, but also has a seam that, I don't know, calls attention to it.
I see.
It's someone like almost counterintuitive. But you also didn't say about the hair covering. There's also the head covering that he was obsessed with.
Head shaving.
The head shaving plus also not wearing a wig, right? He
And
was
Bayhood.
So come on, no?
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
Oh, man.
If you want to. You don't have to talk about it.
Yeah. No. We were taught that he was very concerned about Bayhood, which was a woman letting her hair grow 2 inches. Bai was for 2. So like bicycle, Bayhood was 2 inches of hair that she would grow out under her head covering. Although later I've heard of people say that it wasn't about growing out the hair, was about showing 2 inches of hair. So there's a debate about what Bayhood really means. But we were taught that Bayhood was about not shaving the head properly, that he was also very concerned about. All of this, though, we understood to be very much about, maybe it was just me that understood it that way, about self-discipline, about heiligkeit. Like you said, Kedusha, it's about holiness. It's about sacrifice for what's important. It's the opposite of vanity. A part of me has always wondered if he intuitively understood that creating a tribe out of disparate people from everywhere who came from so many different traditions meant asking a lot of them in order to make sure that they weren't signing up for something they weren't ready to deliver on. Because a lot of people came from traditions that they didn't want. They were wearing short sleeves. They were not covering their heads.
Right. Which is interesting because, I mean, that's another facet of Satmar. How often did you have at your Shabbos table, strangers? I can't speak for you, but I don't think we ever had outsiders because it was very insular. It was very close. It was very insular. There was not much room for outsiders, and part of it probably is because the bar was so high and so demanding and so difficult.
Interesting. Before this interview, I spoke to someone about trying to figure out how to speak about the Satmar Rebbe. This is something I've been thinking a lot, but asking myself a lot. How can I have a discussion about Satmar Rebbe? Because you'll have a discussion with one person and you'll come away with a black picture and another person come away with a white picture. And it feels to me almost impossible to really have this discussion. And that person said, one of the things that often gets left out of the discussion is the incredible social engineering that he accomplished.
Yeah. And you have to wonder how much of it was deliberate and how much of it was not, right? you can see it as, I mean, the fact is that he did have an incredible control of over thousands and thousands of people, men and women, who listened to every word of his, who, here we are, how many years after his passing, and he still looms large over people's lives. But, like so many things, it's in the eye of the beholder. You can say this is a testament of his greatness, right? He's such a great man who is able to really influence such a large swath of people. Or you can say that there's something negative about it, right? This is someone who is manipulative, who manipulated people into submission to his will. And I don't know. I must have been torn. There are times when I see this ability as a testament to his greatness, but there are times I feel like, was it deliberate? Was it on purpose? Did he? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's a hard question to answer because he was a very complex person.
The line between manipulation and leadership is really hard to define.
Yep.
I think.
Exactly.
So do you think there was something in particular about him that made him so effective at social engineering that other Hasidic rabbis who survived the Holocaust didn't have? What made Satmar so successful that it came from nothing and became the largest group in the United States?
Right. I think impressionistically, there are two things. Maybe there's one. People don't appreciate what a larger than life person he was. He had a mean side to him, as I said before, and I can go on all night, tell you stories about him where he hurt people, insulted people, and but there was also a side of him that was so tender, so loving, so kind, so giving, especially for his community. He looked out for his community. If people were going through a rough time, whether it was financially or emotionally, he made sure to provide for them, to take care of them. People felt it. People felt loved by him. My grandfather felt deeply cared by the Rebbe. In fact, when he would go to the Rebbe, it's difficult to go to the Rebbe before the high holidays or sometimes during the year. And my grandfather's name was Yosef, and he called him Yasala. Now, you and I can think big deal, but when it's this big Rebbe has kind of a nice, tender, soft name for you, it has a tremendous impact. The Rebbe loves me. The Rebbe cares about me. And the other thing is also that he was larger than life intellectually. I mean, people don't appreciate his scholarship. He was very knowledgeable. He was a huge Talmid Chacham. If you want to debate the particulars of what he knew more and what he knew less, between the different genres in Judaism, Talmud versus Shulchan Aruch, stories versus halacha, we can get into the weeds, but that's not interesting. He was an incredibly knowledgeable person, and you read his books and they flow with knowledge. And that becomes very, very impressive. And he was a bundle of energy. I'm sure you grew up with the same stories I did about Simchas Torah, right? The holiday that comes at the end of Sukkot, where the holiday is primarily celebrated by dancing with the Torah, and he would dance tirelessly for hours and hours and hours. And that leaves an impression on you. It leaves an impression on you of a deep emotional connection. And like I said in the beginning, the fact of the matter is that I was at his funeral and 100,000 people, I can testify to each and every one person, the overwhelming majority cried like little babies because of his passing. So he clearly had an incredible pull. He was also a big schmoozer. I should mention one more thing. He loved schmoozing for hours.
Okay, we have to define what schmoozing is, because the whole world misses out on schmoozing. They think schmoozing is this sneaky thing of working someone. That's not what schmoozing is.
No, not at all.
Schmoozing is good, long discussion where it's like, wow, 4 hours has passed.
6 hours just went by.
Exactly.
And they're interesting. They're fun. You go from one topic to another. It's relaxed. It's open. It's funny. I mean, people who listen to the recordings kind of almost have a hard time reconciling the public persona with a private persona. He had so much fun just raconteuring and schmoozing and a little bad-mouthing his opponents in a funny way. There was something very human about him.
So what
Okay.
happened after the Satmar rabbi died, since he didn't leave any heirs?
So there are basically primarily two parts to the aftermath, so to speak, the story of what happens after he dies. And if a picture is 1,000 words, this picture is 1,000,000 words about the aftermath, because I think anybody who looks at it notices something very obvious, right?
Wow, there's a woman.
Right? Everybody that looks at it like, wait, these are these Hasidim who have these strict rules about separating men from women and all that. And here, right in the middle, next to him, there's a woman in the midst of so many men. Now, this is Altafai. This is his second wife. She was an incredible powerhouse. And maybe we'll have another session about her. There's so many stories to say about her, but the gist of it is he was, and again, this is very insiderish. I don't know if your listeners will understand. She was a Polish woman, which is another way of saying she was a
Sharp.
strong woman, but she became an incredible powerhouse. And then, but as I said before, he did not get along with his daughter. And then when the Rebbe's daughter dies, he has a surviving nephew, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. He did not get along with him, which essentially meant there was nobody to take over. The Rebbe dies. There are no children. The nephew, who is the closest relative, he despises him. And she becomes an obstacle to basically the continuity. But she's also an incredible figure that there's a significant number of people who gather around her, right? She's almost like a Rebbitzin / Rebbe, and people will be kind of shocked to hear there's a shul where there's no Rebbe, but she is, so to speak, the person in lieu of a Rebbe, right? The Rebbitzins Beis Medrash, it's called, in the back of the big shul. And she survives him, and for a very long time, she remains a very big figure in the story, in the narrative of Satmar. One thing I'll say is that one of the things Chendi is very famous for is for being very dedicated to charity. I mean, she distributed thousands and thousands of dollars for charity. She was very into charity and also very strong, but very opposed to the Rebbe's survivors. And that caused a little bit of a break in the continuity. But eventually, this she kind of is sidelined. She, the one on the left, is the same as her sideline, and the person on the right, which is his nephew, takes over. Be put into the shoes of Rabbi Yael Teitelbaum is very, very hard. Those are such enormous shoes that nobody can really fill them. So he takes over. He has a significant number of people who transition, but Satmar is never the same anymore. With Rabbi Yael gone, too many people felt it's over. There's nothing that can be done to replace him. So I would say like 70, perhaps 80% of the community follows the new leader. Reb Moshe is his name, Reb Moshe Teitelbaum. But there's strong opposition to him. There's strong opposition to him, active and passive. In other words, there's some people who think he's not worthy of the title. He shouldn't be in this position. And then there are those who say, you know what? He just doesn't do it for me the way the Rebbe did, the way Rabbi Yael did for me. And I'm just going to go to the next door shul, the next door synagogue across the street. I'm not embracing him as my Rebbe. And a lot of people kind of, peter out. And then when he dies, that's when the crazy split happens in Satmar. The people at the bottom are his two sons. The one on the left is named Aaron. The one on the right is named Zalman Leib. And they basically become now two Satmars, which is pretty common today in almost every Hasidic community. The kind of big leader dies, they leave children behind, and they become splinter groups. And that's where some people who are familiar with Satmar terminology might hear Aroni and Zaloni, because this is Aaron, and Aaron's followers become the Aronim, and Zalman Leib's followers becomes the Zalonim. No time for that. These are two very different people. Very different. Each of them has their strengths and their weaknesses. But now you have two Satmars, and they're very, very separate with their own newspapers, their own synagogues, their own schools, their own women's ritual baths, and so on and so forth. But that's a story for another day.
Yeah. Except for one thing, which is a highlight if you come on my walking tour, not in a positive sense, but it's a major spot to see in Williamsburg, which is the enormous synagogue that is sitting half constructed on 550 Bedford Avenue. It was going to be enormous, one of the largest synagogues in the world. And because of the break between Reb Aaron and Reb Zalman Leib, between the two brothers, the Aronim and the Zalonim, this part of the estate of the Satmar group wasn't allocated to either brother, and it just sits there since the 1990s, rusting away.
I had no idea.
Yeah,
I had no idea.
yeah.
I had no idea.
It looks like
I had no idea.
it's one of New York City's longest-standing incomplete projects. It's like it
Fascinating.
makes it into lists of New York City's longest-standing real estate stories.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I will give you a backhanded plug before we wrap up, actually. It's going to sound like a competition, but actually it's a plug. So I'm not a tour guide, but we do have a friend in Tel Aviv, and we go every summer to Tel Aviv for 2 months. And every summer he takes us around to different places in Tel Aviv, and he shows us very interesting places. So one time I get a phone call from him, and he says, Yisachar, I'm coming to America. I want reciprocity. Give me a tour of Williamsburg. I'm like, are you crazy? A tour? I have no idea how to give a tour. I've never done it. He said, I don't know, make it up. Anyway, long story short, Frida, I figured out a tour, and I just realized how much of the story Williamsburg tells. Like, how many buildings tell the story of Satmar? How many, like one example, it's like when you look on Bedford Avenue, the two sides of the block, the street, on the one side is the old Rebbitzon's home, and across the street, there is this huge mansion for the new Rebbe, and you're thinking, why didn't he move into the old one? Oh, because there's a big fight and they just despised each other. So they had to have two homes right across the street each other. Williamsburg tells a lot of the stories. So much to see there.
Yeah.
So much to see there. So one day I'll take you tour.
Oh, okay. We'll give each other the tour. We'll have to.
Okay.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay. I do have to say, Williamsburg has a lot of historic buildings, a lot of architectural story, and it's really interesting that the locals don't really generally have an appreciation of the kind of history that is retained in a lot of buildings that would have otherwise been turned into condos, but are sitting there with so much history. Yeah. Anyway, we're going off topic. I do have a final question before we wrap up. It is so late, but as I was preparing for this interview, I had the real desire to ask you a specific question, and I decided to stop myself from asking it at the beginning of the interview because it's completely off topic. But now that we're at the end of the interview, and those who are still with us, we really appreciate you, but we don't expect people to, we have the liberty to go a little off topic here. The question is as follows. No, don't get nervous. The question is as follows. Since I left the Hasidic community, people repeatedly ask me, I must have gotten this question 100 times. If you leave Satmar, fine, I don't judge you for leaving Satmar. Satmar is very extreme. But why don't you become a different form of Orthodox? If you became a different form of Orthodox, I would understand. I'm telling you, I get this question every so often. Every person who poses a question seems to feel like they have just come with a question with great freshness. It is so, again, you get the question.
It's coming America, exactly. Right.
My question to you, though, is since you did not go, you satisfied what people ask me about. Do you get applause? Do people say, Sascha, you're a hero. We love you. You're perfect. We support you 100%. We have no criticism of you. Have you found the sweet spot where people don't criticize you anymore?
See, so it's so funny that you should ask that because, I think we all get that, right? Why do they have to leave all the way to the end? Couldn't they become? So my personal piece of that is fascinating. When I left and I became modern Orthodox, and actually I became affiliated with a more progressive side of modern Orthodoxy, I was the villain to all the people who knew me. And remember, I taught a class in Borough Park for 9 years where about 100 people came every evening. They felt so cheated and so disappointed by me. Like, what's going on with you? You're leaving real Judaism and adopting this weird, wrong, incorrect Judaism, and they don't even fully understand what does that mean. Modern Orthodoxy, it seems like a contradiction to them. Here's the funny thing that happens, Frida. Years go by and things have turned 180. I now, on average, once a month, will get a phone call from someone and says, "Hey, Saskar, it looks like my son is heading out. What do you think I can do to convince him to be like you?"
Wow.
So all of a sudden, modern Orthodoxy actually seems like the ideal alternative instead of having so many people who leave, as you know, right? The attrition rate is significant. And all of a sudden, I know that the tide has changed so interestingly. So I become like a model of like, I wish my son would become that way. And I think also B, so many of the people who condemned me early on come to appreciate more that actually it takes a lot of, energy and commitment to say, I am out, but I'm not going out all the way. Because I think the answer to the question that you mentioned is that you and I know how hard it is to leave. You
Yeah.
don't leave overnight. You don't leave in a year. It is so difficult emotionally. It's so hard. And for most people, if I left, let me enjoy it all the way. I mean, what's the point of leaving Satmar just so that I don't have to wear a shtreimel and I can wear jeans, but I still don't eat gebrachts, which is a certain level of chametz. I still wait till the last time for Shabbos and all that, which all I do. For most people, that's the question, And the other thing I say, which my son reminds me, is that I am unique in the sense that my lack of secular education did not in any way get in the way of me succeeding professionally. In fact, I happen to be in a profession where the lack of secular education, which means that I have more of a Jewish education, is valued, right? I happen to be a rabbi, a teacher. So the Satmar education actually was not a hindrance for me to really succeed in life. 99% of the people, that's not the case. For 99% of the people, leave like, wait, I wasted 20 years of my life. I am now a kindergartner when it comes to
Yeah.
the secular world and secular studies. And I have to appreciate that. It is
Yeah.
true. Satmar education did not hurt me professionally and emotionally, but that's not the case for most people who leave. So it's very different.
So the
Very
takeaway of
different.
this interview is that if you leave the Satmar community, become a rabbi.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Absolutely.
Okay.
Or at least talk to me.
talk to Sasha. It was a pleasure to talk to you,
Yeah.
in fact. And to the viewers, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you're on the podcast, I appreciate you tuning in on the podcast. I am going to be putting links in to Yissachar's Facebook page. Is there anything else we can link or anything you want to shout out? Are we all good? Okay.
No, I think we're fine. We covered as much as we can cover in the amount of time.
In the amount of time. All right. I really,
Right.
really appreciate you being so forthcoming.
My pleasure, Frida.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Good night.
much.